Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Good Governance for Utilities and Energy Companies. We're pleased that you've joined us today, and before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and we have 2 great presenters with us today from Moss Adams. We have Colleen Rozillis, Business Consulting Partner, and Julie Desimone, Energy Industry Group Leader. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Colleen to get the presentation started.
Thanks so much, Amy, and welcome everyone. We're really excited to be here today to talk about our favorite topic, governance. So today we're going to cover a few things. We're going to just cover governance in general and what good governance is. We'll talk about what it means to be an effective board and give some really good technical advice on finance, investment, and audit committees and the work that occurs in those committees. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to have an effective meeting, particularly in the post-pandemic landscape. Here are our required learning objectives, and I'm going to hand it back to Amy to run our first poll and see who's here in the room.
All right, thank you, Colleen. So the first polling question is, what is your role in your organization? And the options are A, board member, B, committee member, C, CEO or executive director, D, management, E, staff, or F, other, not applicable. And the polling questions are located right on the slides that we're presenting. If you can't see it, you can hit the F5 key to refresh your console.
I always like asking this question first. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Amy.
No, sorry. I was just going to make sure that you hit that submit button once you select your response. That way it tracks your CPE.
So this won't change our content, but it does give us a good sense of who's here, and it eases you into that CPE requirement. Sometimes we have a room full of board members. We get really interesting questions, and other times it's a lot more staff, and the questions can be really different.
I think too, Colleen, make sure that you put questions in the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer those as we go through the session. But again, we may run out of time. We've got a full slide deck for an hour show. So if we don't get to those questions, we will make sure to follow up individually with you, but we'll try to answer them during the presentation as well.
All right, and here are our results. So a lot more management and staff in the room, which is great. So really happy to take questions that you all have about kind of the board staff partnership, the ability to provide information, decision-making, all of that sort of stuff. And as Julie said, we'll try to answer as we go along. So I'm going to cover first just what good governance is. So governance is a framework, it's a culture, it's behaviors, but really it's the idea of what the policies that we have in process, the systems that support our board and our leadership, the structures that we have in place, and ultimately our strategic framework that the governing body, we're going to use the term board in this case. We know some entities use sort of different names, but we're just going to use board as sort of the overarching role for this presentation. And it's really to ensure that leadership makes good decisions and helps to deliver on the organization's mission both effectively and accountably. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. Every board has kind of basic responsibilities. There are responsibilities by law, things like the duty of care, fiduciary responsibility, but ultimately the board does some really core things. They establish the strategic framework for the organization. They set the direction overall. What is our mission? What is our vision? Where are we going? How are we getting there? They ensure the accountability of the performance toward those goals. And they also provide goodwill and support. And that's something that can sometimes be left, particularly if you're an organization that might have an elected or an appointed board. It's not necessarily in a private organization. You might be a part of the organization. You may be a part of the ownership. If you're elected or appointed, sometimes that goodwill and support can be difficult to bring on and build over time because folks might run, for example, for a utility board because they're interested in making change happen. But it's really, really important to understand that you're a part of leadership. We're all one organization, and this is the direction that we're going in. So when a board is seated, there are a number of core functions that the board has in terms of each board member's responsibilities. So we think about understanding and defining board member duties and responsibilities. What is the scope of our role? What do we do every day, and how does our board function? Understanding the ethics that we must operate under, so thinking about state and federal laws associated with ethics for any board, as well as our sort of personal code of conduct, how we behave, and conflicts of interest are particularly important for any board, disclosing them, understanding why they're important, making sure folks are educated in them. Behaving confidentiality, that's a really important of any member's role. So when we think about being confidential, making sure that we can make decisions and keep things that belong in the boardroom, that's a really core function of any board member. And then evaluating management performance. So that's both kind of fulfilling your fiduciary responsibility and making sure that we're making good decisions, but also avoiding that micromanaging piece. I'll get into that a little bit later, but really what we want to do is think about focusing on outcomes and not necessarily focusing on day-to-day, because we have management and staff, we have our CEO or executive in order to have them decide the how, and that we really focus on the what. A board very much focuses on that high-level vision and strategic direction of the organization. We want to think 3, 5, 10, 20 years out in the future. What do we need to do to get there? And management focuses on that implementation piece. The board is also a responsibility for governance for not just the organization, but any subsidiaries, partnerships, things like that. So really thinking about how are we reporting up for subsidiary companies? How do we report? How do we have representation for any partnerships and things like that? And what does the board need to approve at this level versus what's really management's responsibility? And then any board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect and safeguard your assets and your investments. And that comes up in a couple of ways. So policies, procedures, internal controls, and also what that management structure is that oversees those and having confidence in it. I think we probably have all worked in organizations where the board really feels like they're not in that sweet spot. They're either really in the weeds, super operational. So I'll give an example. One of my clients several years ago, we had a board member who every month would request all of the credit card statements from across the organization because they wanted to look at each transaction. And that is not a board member's job. That is, unless you are like really concerned about fraud and you need to engage somebody, that is absolutely too far in the weeds. And And then we often have folks who are up too high. So when we might hear the term a rubber stamp board, where management just provides everything, they don't ask a lot of questions, they're good with it. They're not necessarily engaged enough to understand that they need to make some decisions and ask tough questions. So we really want the board focused in kind of that middle area, in that sweet spot where we're very much focused on strategy and policy and those longer term outcomes. This table really breaks down the difference between what a board does and what the CEO does. And when we think about the board staff partnership, a clear understanding among all board members and among the management team of this is really important. Some of the boards that I work with, we do things like we provide something like this at the beginning of every year. So not just in onboarding activities, but really kind of that baseline setting. Here's who we are, here's what's important to us. So when we think about things like the board looks at plans that management presents, right? So we review and approve plans, and then management also implements those plans and reports on progress. The board supervises and evaluates typically just the CEO. Sometimes the board may have legal counsel, sometimes internal audit reports directly to the board, but typically there's one employee and it's the CEO, and the board supervises and evaluates just that person. They can provide input to other personnel, but we leave the personnel management to the CEO. I think the budget is also a really great example of this, right? Your board is not in there reviewing the entire budget and getting really in the weeds about budget detail. The CEO and the finance team is developing the budget and then providing those kind of key areas. Where do we need to make decisions? How do we use the budget to implement our strategic plan? That's a really important piece of this that sometimes boards can get a little bit too in the weeds there. The other really important thing that a board does is approves and guides the strategic plan. Every organization that is high performing has a documented strategy, has goals, understands what direction we're going, and moves in that direction as one. People understand how they fit in terms of the mission. People understand how they're helping the organization to achieve goals. Over the last several years, because we've just been through a global pandemic, a lot of strategic plans that were developed pre-pandemic kind of went out the window, and we're seeing a lot of organizations re-engage in strategic planning. And the board's role in strategic planning is very much at that kind of high level. Should we revisit our values as an organization if we haven't updated them in 5 years? Who are we as an employer? How do we want to differentiate ourselves? How do we want to talk about ourselves in the marketplace? That's a really great discussion for board members to have. We also think about the board doing things like setting those long-term goals, setting that long-term strategy, and that should absolutely be in collaboration with management. And then what we want to see in a high-performing organization is that management is doing implementation, they've got really good outcome-based performance measures, and is providing regular feedback on a quarterly or semi-annual basis to the board, saying, here's how we're performing, we're on track or we're not on track, and here's what we need your input with. Julie, I know you have worked with hundreds of utilities and energy companies. Do you have thoughts on the board's role in strategy?
I do for sure. I think one of the maybe downfalls that we tend to see from time to time in this area is just the headwinds, and really understanding and making sure we've got a complete understanding of the headwinds that are going to be facing our organizations. As we know, in the energy space, it is changing crazy, but then our bedrock of what we do has stayed pretty much the same for a long period of time. So do we understand what those headwinds are? How are we evaluating those? We know right now one of the biggest concerns that we have is staffing. Where are our employees going to come from in the future? Do we have access to enough employees in the right place? And so how does the board look to that and set the organization at a very high level in looking at those headwinds into the future? It's not a static, it's not about today, it's about tomorrow as well. And so I think that's one of the most important parts, because I think in the utility industry and in the energy industry, energy has been around for a really long time, and there's a lot of our policies and procedures that have been around for a really long time. And what do we need to change in the future that gets us to that dynamic employer that people want to work for, and we've got the right people at the right time making the right decisions to keep what is a very big job running forward. So I'm going to take it forward from here. And one thing that we think is really important when we talk about a board is this concept of fiduciary responsibility. So this comes up all the time, but it's amazing. If you put 100 board members and management teams in a room and ask them to define what fiduciary responsibility, the best part is to try to get them to write it down. Of those 100 people, you would get answers all over the board. It would be crazy to say, what does a fiduciary responsibility mean to you? So this is a more formal definition of a fiduciary responsibility, and it's really to safeguard the assets of the organization and their subsidiaries. You should be approving large transactions and initiatives, and again, keying on that large, significant transactions. This does not necessarily mean getting into the weeds in every transaction by any shape of the imagination. Also approving your annual budget or your biannual budget, whatever that is, making sure that you understand it in enough detail. And I think what Colleen said earlier was a really important fact. A board should be understanding the flow of the budget in enough detail to see that they're meeting the strategic direction of the organization. And that's a critical key. It's not trying to funnel down into the last dollar to see what that last dollar looks like. It's saying, if we apply this budget this year, are we getting strategically to where we're trying to move to an organization? Where we often see misses on this is sometimes, especially in our rate setting utilities and energy companies, we see an issue here where strategically we know the headwinds are ahead of us, where we've got a rate plan, but then the budget doesn't actually coincide with what that strategic direction from a rate making perspective is. And so that's an important thing to consider. Are those alignments happening within the organization? If we know we're in a talent war, we know we've said we want to be doing things different from either a payroll or compensation, is that reflected correctly within your budget? Those are the things that we need to start thinking about and making sure we move strategically to. In a subsidiary or a board, or when you are, what that means is really, if you're a board member on the parent company and you have subsidiaries, are you going to appoint and approve board members? Are you going to represent on that board? And what does it mean to represent on a board or on a subsidiary versus the original board? And understanding what your functions are and your duties of care are in each of those organizations. So here is breaking it down even further for the fiduciary duty. It really comes down to three major components: a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience. The duty of care is really just having a level of competence and judgment expected of a board member. Now this can change. I actually just got off my second term on the Moss Adams Executive Board, and I can tell you, when I walked in my boardroom on the first day, I sure didn't have a level of competence as when I hopefully what people would say I had a better level of competence when I walked out. Now, what that really means is there's a lot of work to do. So being willing to come to the board to do the work, to get to know the industry if you don't know it, to get to know the entity if you don't know it. And a lot of work needs to go into any board seat that you have. There's also a duty of loyalty, putting the organization above yourself, trying to avoid those conflicts of interest. And when they do occur, because sometimes they do, making sure to disclose and let everybody know about those conflicts of interest. And then finally, our duty of obedience, keeping the organization on course to accomplish your stated goals and obey the law. That's the really big bedrock of what we're trying to do from a governance board. So how that's done, be informed, ask questions, but try to really think of those questions. Are they the right level of questions that you're asking for the organization? And ask help when you need it. Be unselfish, responsive, try to stay as objective. I know we're humans, so that doesn't always happen, but sometimes we'll have to step back and say, okay, maybe not being objective, let's walk a different path. Be honest, trustworthy, and investigate the irregularities. I mean, we definitely, if something isn't making sense to you, ask the questions about it. We generally have pretty good guts and ask the question and be transparent about why you're asking that question. So getting into, it's been interesting. So Colleen and I have been around the block a few times, or a few decades, I guess I should say, Colleen. I think me more decades than you. But one of the things that we have definitely seen over the past 20 plus years, 30 years, is board policies, and understanding what's the difference between a board policy and a management policy, and who runs those and how they're ran. And again, we say written policies. Written policies are a great thing. And here's why they're a great thing. When something occurs within the organization and it's not written as to what correct behavior is, then there can be a lot of pointing fingers. And people are saying, well, I didn't know I was supposed to tell you this. I think a conflict of interest is a great thing. I didn't know I was supposed to tell you that I was a part of this major transaction that the entity just got into, to the rest of the board members. When you have it written down, you've gone through the thinking to make sure that those policies are valid, and we think that they're the right thing that we need to disclose. And number two, when you write it down, it removes some of the gray area. Not all the gray area, but it definitely removes some of the gray area and the level of expectations by the board members. So on the left-hand side is some of our musts. And the reason that we say these are musts is primarily because of that. These are the ones that we see come up quite a bit, to where this can help the entity make sure to avoid confusion in the future. So conflict of interest is a great one to have. The cybersecurity assessment, this is a new one, and policies around this. This is actually stemming from some SEC behavior. So the SEC is starting a requirement that all SEC companies are required to have cybersecurity assessments and policies at the board level. And as we know, I would guess that most of you on this call aren't SEC registrants. However, these types of things do tend to funnel down into our private and our public clients. And so this is a good one to have, primarily because we're being pinged constantly, and we need to know what the board policy is versus what the management's requirements are. Gift acceptance is a good one. Joint ventures, if you have one. I think after Sarbanes-Oxley, the whistleblower policies definitely came up to the board level. We see that constantly and what that looks like. And then document retention and destruction as well. The ones on the right-hand side, the written policies that are good to have, these are great ideas or to work for. And again, it gets into making sure we understand who and what we should be doing at the board level versus the management level. So a bunch of policies on here. You all have access to the slide deck after, so there's a lot of words on here you can come back and take a look at in the future. Again, tons of words on this page. I'm not going to go over this in an excruciating amount of detail, but these are some of the organizational policies. So this is getting down to the managerial level and some of the different types of policies that should be looked at. There's board-related types of policies that you should have, and then other policies that don't fit necessarily within the board level on the personnel and the financial side. So a bunch of different policies that you can have. I will say though, policies are one of those things that can tend to be, and Colleen, you can kick in on this, that can tend to be, and you work really hard on them. They're really great for the first year. You put a lot of thought, and then they go where? Into the desk drawer. And you shut the desk drawer and you potentially forget about it. So if you're going to come up with policies for the board, what kind of frequency are you looking at? What kind of frequency are you looking at managerial policies to make sure they're all in alignment with each other? I think that's an important thing that's we're thinking about from a board level and from a managerial level.
I would totally agree with that. Julie said, right, there's a lot of policies listed on this slide. Really, the ones that are not board related in that furthest left column, what you want to do as a board member is make sure that these are either in place or have been considered. So do we have a policy on intellectual property? Do we have an up-to-date policy on use of credit cards? And then I would take an organizational risk lens and say which ones need to be updated most frequently. In an ideal world, we're looking at our policies kind of every 2 to 3 years to make sure they still fit our current operating environment, because things change really fast, especially if we're thinking about things like cyber risk, like ESG, like cryptocurrency, right? Those things we want to keep updated. Employment policies also, but we also, this goes back to that fiduciary responsibility that the board members have. So our goal is to make sure that the organization runs effectively and uses our resources as effectively as possible. And so that means that some of these things do have to be in place.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note too that not your organization is not going to need, we put a whole laundry list of policies out here for your consideration. I would say a lot on that board related we'd want to see in play, but not, your organization may not need all of these. So again, that risk assessment should also come in the form of, do we need the policy or not? You don't want to have a policy just to have a policy. You want it to be effective within the organization. So we got a good question in the chat regarding the document retention and whether that should really be a board policy or whether that should be a managerial policy. And I think it's a great one. And I think there's an answer to that. And Colleen, let's see if you agree with me. I think it should be both. And the reason that I should think it should be both is because we want to make sure you're following federal and state guidelines. And that's at the board. I mean, obeying the laws is really making sure we're looking at that from a board level, that what's in place that meets those. I think there's a much more detailed policy of exacting standards that we are going to keep payroll records for X long. We are going to keep, whatever for X long. Those are the type of ones that's going to get into the managerial. So that's in the detail. What we really want at the board level is there a document retention policy, and does it follow and obey applicable laws and regulations? Colleen, do you have any thoughts on that?
100%. I would want a board policy that said something like, our organization shall have a document retention policy that abides by federal and state requirements, bond requirements, things like that. And then everything else is really delegated to management to identify exactly those timelines and how it's done.
Perfect. So that hopefully will give you, that was a great question, because that'll give you an idea of what the differences we mean between a board policy and between a managerial, which will be quite often way more in depth. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the code of conduct policies. So, the success of a board really depends on your trust and confidence that you've earned from your stakeholders. And your stakeholders are defined differently within every one of our organizations. So they might be ratepayers, they might be customers, they might be your employees, or they will definitely be your employees. What a code of conduct does is it lays out the expectations and guiding principles for appropriate workplace behavior. And this gets into the last point that we just made. It is not in a significant amount of detail. It's not going to go into, substance abuse. It's not going to go into the details, a real detail that we do expect to have at the organization at the policy level from an HR perspective. But what it does is it's saying at a high level, this is what we're expecting. And the board is going to say, this is the level of expectation we want from our employees and from others. It needs to be designed with consideration to your values, shareholders, customers, professionals you work with. I mean, really, it has to have the all-encompassing lens. How do you want people to conduct themselves as your employee or as your management team and as your board on a daily basis within the organization and to people outside of the organization? We also think that conflict of interest policies are pretty key. And again, this can change throughout organizations and what your board is. But I will tell you, we do get involved in quite a few of these when they go sideways. And, something is happening and we've, maybe identified, maybe we're going out for an audit, identified a potential conflict of interest. It could be anything like a transaction was done and we didn't know a board member was a part of the other party to that. And that never got raised to the board. Without this conflict of interest policy, what this really helps with is ensures that we understand as board members and our management teams, we understand when things need to be disclosed and what the time frame around those disclosures need to happen. And somebody has stepped back and said, hey, I'm going to think about this and what seems appropriate as a board member and potentially as a management team in disclosing these different things. So putting that in paper so that it is crystal clear is very important in the organization. Conflicts are going to happen. I mean, we're all in communities where we have other businesses a lot as board members, and therefore conflicts will occur. It's more of what are okay, what isn't, and how do we disclose that on a timely and consistent basis. It also should go over what the prohibited voting. So let's say that a board member is a part of a transaction, when they should and shouldn't vote, because that can get, if you don't have that in writing and haven't put that as a policy, it can get a little dicey at times when a board member may think they should vote and other board members believe that that is inappropriate. So this is a good one, I would say, one of the highest on my personal list of seeing in the board level as well. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Amy for our second polling slide.
All right, thank you, Julie. So the second polling question is, how comprehensive are your board policies and procedures? A, our policies are complete and up to date. B, we have some policy gaps. C, our policies need a full update. Or D, I don't know. And then just a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions.
You know, Julie, when you were talking about code of conduct and having the board involved in that, I think is so important, because it's the board really sets the tone for any organization. And so if we have an employee conduct policy and the board doesn't have one, or the board doesn't abide by it, that can sink your whole organizational culture by not having that strong leadership. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I think that's so important when we're drafting those and also holding folks accountable to them.
Right, and it's not just, so we're absolutely clear, it's not, that code of conduct should cover the board as well. And it's right behavior from your leaders on the board as well. So it should be over the board and management and the rest of your employee teams as well.
Great results. We've got a third of folks who have policies that are up to date. Like that's probably the best that I've seen. So that's great to see. Everyone who answered that, pat yourself on the back. And everyone else, thank you for being honest. And there's lots of really great example policies all over the internet to look at. So I'm going to go into what makes an effective board and really around kind of the habits and culture of an effective board. Number one, it's really important for board members to think and act strategically, to have that strategic mindset. So I absolutely harped on this in the first part of this presentation, but very much thinking about how can we focus on that long-term piece? How can I leave a legacy? That's one way. If you're a member of management or staff and you have a director who's really stuck in the weeds, to start asking them questions like that, to think if we can shift their mindset. It's also a piece of thinking about ourselves, again, is that kind of shared organization. So we have a responsibility, not just to ourselves, not just to ratepayers or potentially investors or employees, but to all of us as a whole. And what does shared constituency mean to us? This is a great question for board members to ask themselves. If we've got an annual retreat, right? Who actually are we representing in this role, and what does that mean to us? We also think it's very important that we have small group decision-making mastered. So the nature of boards, they often change. We rotate folks on and off. What our culture is and what our decision-making framework is can change on a regular basis. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but even just acknowledging we have a decision-making culture, here's how we behave toward each other, and understanding that it might change, or the things that we want to uphold are important. It's also really good to have those clear rules and procedures for meetings. A lot of boards follow Robert's rules, although we're seeing some folks kind of move away from that, but understanding how do we make decisions and what are the procedures that we follow. In part, that's legality driven, but also it's important for us if we do have conflict, if we have a really tough decision, we have those procedures to fall back on, and that's a really great place that we can center ourselves if that's a challenge. We also really recommend a regular evaluation of the board's performance. So conducting an annual self-assessment of the board, doing that self-assessment, it's very easy to just do sort of a quick survey. You could just have an open conversation. Sometimes boards have facilitators like me come in to run that process if there are some things that they want to do, or they think that discussion might be a little bit difficult. That's something that we're regularly engaged in, but it provides so much value to just have that inward look. What did we say we were going to accomplish this year? What did we accomplish? What value did we add? How did I do as an individual board member? And then I think really important for individuals is to think about that continual learning, continual development. As we mentioned already, the board really sets the tone. If you want your organization to have a learning culture, a coaching culture, an innovative culture, board members have to have that too. We can't have board members that are, well, this is the way we've always done things, or stuck kind of in that past. We really want folks to be seeking out industry knowledge, knowledge on governance, really broadening their skill set in order to bring the most value to our organizations. There are a number of things that really make up the board culture that we can control or management can influence. One of those is that form of governance. So while a lot of folks kind of have a traditional board, they might use Robert's rules, we're actually seeing quite a move to policy governance and much more outcomes-based governance across lots of types of boards, as well as some other forms of governance that might be consensus-based or a little bit more relaxed. Because it turns out if you're not Congress, you might not need to use Robert's Rules of Order as much as we feel like we should. Although I do love parliamentary procedure. We mentioned a lot around kind of our policies and procedures, right? Setting up what is our communication style, how formal will we be, how will we talk with each other and talk with our CEO and staff, and what are those expectations for communication that can all be set forth in your policies and procedures. And that what also can be established there is how much information do board members have? Do they get information? Do they go through the CEO for everything? Is there a board liaison? Are there other staff that they go to directly? And how do we communicate in between meetings as well? Thinking about things like quorum, thinking about things like not doing side dealing, but also making sure that folks have the right kind of information and that they have strong relationships. And then you're nominating and onboarding practices. Those can be very formal, but we also use those to really identify and uphold the culture of our board. How do we build trust between folks? How do we manage our conflict? How do we move through the governance together as a group and in a collaborative fashion? The board staff partnership is really, really important to the success of any organization. And that is very much founded in these 4 principles of trust, respect, candor, and communication. If we do not have those between the executive and the board, and particularly the individual that's in the board chair seat, it's going to be really difficult to get our strategic goals accomplished. So we recommend regular check-ins, that both sides are committed to no surprises. The board should never be in a full board meeting where something is a huge surprise. We should be having one-on-one meetings. We should be seeding issues. We should make sure if we need to have emergency meetings, emergency committee meetings, that we go ahead and do that. Both sides also need to practice that strategic thinking and have that frequent communication. And we need to have clear expectations about what their relationship looks like. That can be identified in policy, that can be identified in the job description for both the executive and the board members, but also holding each other accountable to that. So having mechanisms to be able to say, hey, this wasn't how I expected it to go. This behavior wasn't in line with our code of conduct or our approach to things. And let's have an honest conversation about it. And then that regular reflection on performance. I can't tell you how many organizations that I work with that are very high performing that the CEO hasn't had an evaluation in a decade because that person is high performing. But that gets your board out of the practice of actually doing that evaluation of the individual's performance and likewise the organization's performance, as well as it really doesn't set the CEO up for success because it doesn't give them that opportunity to reflect on their performance and to think about what they're doing well. When we think about any group, we're constantly needing to work on building that decision-making capacity. And there are a lot of different pieces that go into it. At a baseline level, we need to understand who our board members are, where they come from, and how they make decisions. And everyone in each of these categories is somewhere on a spectrum. So how they exercise influence. Are they a loud voice in the boardroom, or are they a quiet voice in the boardroom, but they exercise their influence outside of the boardroom? Do they need a lot of information up front? Do they need a lot of time to process before they make decisions, or do they go with their gut? Is their conflict style direct? Is it passive? Do they avoid conflict? That's really important to understand. And sometimes you don't know that until you're really in the trenches with somebody. But if you've got folks who have very differing conflict styles, that can cause a lot of challenges for your organization when you do need to make tough decisions. How folks deal with their individual priorities and concerns. So everyone comes to a board, a leadership team with their own priorities. If you have someone, for example, like me or Julie that has, a financial background, then we're probably going to ask a lot of questions about our audited financial statements. if we file disclosures, what that looks like, right? And there might be folks who have absolutely no knowledge or understanding or even really care about that part, and they care a lot about HR, or they care a lot about environmental impact. And so those are things we need to understand about folks. And then I think probably the most important is having that sense of group identity. Where does everyone fall on that spectrum of coming to the board as an individual versus being there for the good of the group? We want folks to really be there for the good of the group and understand that, but that absolutely is a journey that board members go on, and it can wax and wane over time and through that board service. So you understanding that about your board, about your colleagues on the board, if you're a board member, is really critical to making good decisions, and also understanding where could we potentially fill gaps and where could we develop board skills. And a lot of folks think about board skill development very much for new board members and onboarding. So Julie mentioned in her own board service, really feeling like you walk into a room and you might know a little bit, but there's a huge learning curve. Excuse me. That is true for so many board members, but it's true throughout your time on the board because organizations are dynamic and change, and everybody has skill gaps. So what we would expect to see in onboarding are these things on the left-hand side of the slide, things like provide that strategic plan, provide 3 to 5 years of financial statements and walk through the financial statements and budget with new board members, walk through the org chart, go through things like your expectations, your bylaws, your policies. We also think that having a board buddy system, or if you're thinking about, board apprenticeship, if you want to build someone up, especially if it's a family-owned company, that can be a great way to move folks into board service. For the full board, every year we like to see ongoing education in some areas. So the board that I'm currently the chair of, we did good governance training last year. We did finance training 2 years ago. And we're just going to repeat that every 2 years so that we have folks who are always grounded in here's what's important to us and here's why we value it. Fiduciary responsibility, you cannot educate your board on that enough, and we would recommend doing that as often as possible. There's really great resources. You can utilize your external auditor to provide that training as well. That's something our teams do all the time. Risk management is really important. Julie mentioned risk at the beginning of this presentation, and that's a key role of any board member to understand the current risk profile and how we can mitigate risk. And risk is always changing. And a couple of things that go into that risk are areas like ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance. So when we think about climate impact, when we think about our social impact, and when we think about oversight of all of those things and how we actually measure our governance and how it impacts our organization, that's a core part of risk management as well as diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and access initiatives. Those are really important for the board to understand who we are as an organization, where we're going, and whether the board wants to set strategy or outcomes in that area. And then finally, good governance. So having regular board training on actually what governance looks like and what direction we need to move in, that's good for establishing and maintaining your board culture. If you have challenges among board members, this can be a really great way to also address conflict without necessarily having to hire a mediator, by having everybody go to governance training and then think about what are norms that we want to establish going forward based on that training. And that's something that I do all the time. So Amy, back to you for another poll.
Thank you, Colleen. So the third polling question is, when was your last board retreat? And your options are in 2023, in the past 2 years, before the pandemic, or we've never had one. And while you're responding to that, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them now from the console. We will also be sending them out via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast.
I'm curious about the answer here. We've done a lot of board retreats this year.
It's coming back from the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
They also feel better, I will say, in doing a lot of them virtually versus doing them in person. I don't know why, they just feel better in person. Feels like you can get more conflict resolved in person than you can over video. These are one of those I'd highly suggest in person.
We work with a lot of boards where folks haven't met in person. They haven't had the opportunity to, because even moving to hybrid meetings, which can give a lot more access to board meetings, it's still, then we haven't had that. So a retreat's a really great way to get that. Yeah.
Right. Interesting that 38.4% said they've never had one. That's an interesting answer. This does give board and management time to just get to know each other too. And I think that that is a key to an ongoing team and working relationship for sure. Okay, let's get into, and this might be a little much on some of the slides because just there's a lot of different committees that you can have, and we're not trying to say that you have to have every one of these, but one of the things that is really effective in a board, both from everybody having a different background and knowledge base, to being able to get smaller groups working a little bit deeper into issues, is the question of finance, investment, and audit committees. So let's talk a little bit about these different committees and the framework, what their responsibilities were, and how they evaluate. And again, I want you to think about whether or not they're actually, which ones are probably needed for the organization versus what functions are happening in different levels. So you may just have one. You might have one finance committee that goes over finance, investment, and goes over your audit. But you might have individual ones as well, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. So when we talk about a finance committee, what we're really trying to do is we're going to establish those charter goals, and we want to use people that have a cross function and diversity characteristics. And what we mean by that is, if you have, on a board of 8 or 9, if you have 4 finance people, maybe not all 4 of them should be in the finance committee. We want to hear other thoughts and other voices as well. We definitely want to have somebody on the finance side just to give that level of clarity and knowledge base too. But again, we want to have different individuals on this board as well. You should be selecting the cadence of the meetings, and again, we're going through this right now. Out of COVID, I think all of us are feeling a little bit over meetinged at the time. We want really effective meetings, so having a good meeting that will help us in understanding what we need to do in this committee. It may be meeting monthly, it could be meeting quarterly, it could be meeting twice a year. It's going to depend on what you're trying to accomplish out of this. So in that primary responsibilities, we talk a lot about what we're doing within this, and I'm not going to go over every single one of this, but probably the biggest one is reviewing and approving how the organizational budget spends and makes money. So going over that in a little bit more depth, and what it takes is to take some of that responsibility off the board level. You can move more onto strategy at the board level if you have these committees making some of these decisions and then running them up the flagpole to the entire board. But it also helps to safeguard your organization's reputation as well. So we're looking at all of those kind of things. It's a sounding board too, which I think is so great, to have a CFO be able to come to a finance committee and say, hey, we're thinking about doing this, or we're thinking about doing that. And it's a testing ground for some of that information, which is a great thing as well. Overall, I think they will oversee the investment committee if you have it as a subcommittee, and approve your custody of cash and investments. I mean, this is a protection mechanism as well. But I think one of the keys when we talk about any of these committees is really this evaluation characteristic. So we need to make sure to evaluate the committee members. If somebody isn't really being impactful on a committee, then maybe they shouldn't be on the committee in the first place. And then 2, are you accomplishing the goals that you set out? So having a clear charter, doing what you need to do, and then having a way to assess those goals and saying, are we moving towards what we need to move towards? This finance committee can also analyze is not a word, Colleen, have analysis gaps in responsibility and procedures. And it can be a really good idea to bring in others. It doesn't just have to be board members. It can bring others that may be a good pipeline for future board service. So we added this one to the Investment and Finance Committee. Again, same framework, same evaluation, just a little bit different in the primary responsibilities. If you have a lot of investments, if you have a lot of subsidiary activity, then generally an investment committee can really focus on those. Focus on the risks coming out of your investments. You may not need that if you don't have this, and this could be rolled up into your Finance Committee. However, if there's a lot of activity, what you're going to find is your Finance finance committee is going to be spending a lot of time on the investments piece and not on the other parts of the finance committee. So something to think about as you're putting in committees. We have a lot of these committees as well that, they definitely have board members on it. They must have board members on it. But we sometimes have management team members, and we sometimes have outsiders of the organization that are a part of these committees as well. In general, the voting, though, on these will generally not have or only happen at the board level when you get to it. But it's more of that working group to really analyze and take a look at what's going on. And then finally, what's near and dear to my heart as an auditor is the audit committee. So again, same thing. The one thing that's probably different is we said a must-have, and I know not every organization has the capacity to do this, but have something in the chair seat that does have a financial mindset or has financial understanding. I think that's really important for some of the conversations that are going to come down the pipe. A lot of the primary responsibilities in this group are really on the external audit and if you have an internal audit function, and really setting, again, not getting deep in the weeds, but really setting what is the fees, what's the scope of what they're doing on an annual basis, does that meet our organizational goals? So making sure that you're a part of that. This would be the group, if you have an audit committee versus a full board, this would be the group that's meeting with your auditors more consistently as they're going through, really understanding what the auditor sees as the risks of the audits, getting report outs in a more in-depth and being able to ask those more in-depth questions that probably don't have the time necessarily in your board meetings. With these, we have seen a lot of this being grown into enterprise risk as well, making sure we understand the enterprise risk and then how that enterprise risk feeds back into your internal controls and what's going on with management and staff to make sure that those risks are addressed. And the evaluate's pretty close to the other ones as well. So we talk about communication in one team, and we really mean, I mean, when we look at, Colleen and I have probably thousands, we've worked with thousands of boards. And at the end of the day, when you're looking with a board that's very effective, those boards have an amazing communication system with the management team. They're able to address conflict because we're, again, humans, we all have different opinions, and conflicts are 100% going to happen and should happen. If you get through a board run where there's been no conflict on the board, I think that might be a warning flag that could be a red flag as well. However, if you do have a board where there's conflict every single meeting, that's probably on the other end of the spectrum of a red flag as well. So what we want to do is we really want a one-team approach. We're really trying to do best by the organization, which sets a tone at the top, set your high standards. Don't tolerate little frauds. And what I mean by this is don't tolerate if you're getting an answer that isn't correct. That's not okay. We need to make sure what you're getting is the correct answers and that we can move forward in a transparent way. Insist on a quality annual audit. Auditors do report to the board just as not the management team. They have to work, obviously, very closely with the management team to get the audit accomplished, but we work for the board. Consideration of an internal audit function, and this really depends on your complexity and the size of your organization, but internal audit can be an interesting thing as long as they're doing things that are really effective to the goal orientation of the energy company. And what I mean by that is if all they're doing is looking at little stuff that really doesn't get to your goals and objectives, then probably spending the money on it doesn't make as much sense. If you can really align it to enterprise risk and really align that internal audit function to what's helping the goals be accomplished by the organization, then that's a huge benefit to the organization. And then finally, taking the findings seriously. This gets back to tone at the top. So a couple of best practices when we were brainstorming through this entire presentation, we were just talking through what are some best practices in thinking about. And really at the board level, it's understanding those new risks facing the industry. I can guarantee that management is thinking of those and is constantly addressing those on a daily basis, making sure that you have a clear understanding to some of those big headwinds that are facing what the organization is going to be going through in the future is incredibly important. Education on regulatory matters. We're all in different states and we all have wacko rules in our different states. I mean, it is amazing by type of entity, by the state. Now the whole thing on granting that's coming down the pipeline, in the power and the energy industry, there's millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions that are going to be piped down in the form of grants, loans, and different credits and incentives. Understanding how what's the impact, what's the risks that the organization faces? Because I can tell you right now, and I'm gonna put the plug in. This is probably another webinar, Colleen. But ultimately, federal money is not free money. There's always strings attached. So understanding what those strings are and how the organization is going to align to those strings is incredibly important before moving into a big granting opportunity. And then spending the amount of time on strategy and not micromanaging. I mean, where are you making sure that every board meeting is full of something to do with a strategical decision or strategic direction that you want in the organization? So I'm going to turn it over to Amy for our final poll question, and then we'll just have a couple more slides and then be done. So, Amy.
All right, thank you. So the last poll is, when was your organization's strategic plan last updated? A, we are currently in the strategic planning process. B, 2022 or later. C, 2020 or before. D, we don't have a strategic plan. Or E, I'm not sure. And then once you've completed all of your CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your certificate from the CPE progress window.
Colleen, there's a great question in the Q&A that I think we can take real quick, and it's regarding the board retreats, who goes to it. I know that the ones I've been associated with, it's usually board and key management and key team members. It may be just depending on what the theme of that strategic retreat. However, I will say there's usually some time set aside for the board to meet independently and have a conversation as well. Any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think a really effective retreat is often a 2-day retreat with the ability to have dinner maybe the night before or the night of, in between the 2 working days, and to have at least one of those days be including staff. You don't have to include all management and staff, but including those key folks who can provide updates on programming, who can provide updates on kind of operational things, and then really help to build those relationships and build that trust as well. I cannot recommend enough taking some long breaks during those meetings for folks to really get to know each other and not everything being business, because that's really going to help you to build your trust and relationships and to move forward in a productive way.
And I love the idea. So long breaks are not 15 minutes. It takes that time to go to the restroom and go. I've heard people 15 minutes instead of 5-minute breaks. These are 30, 45-minute breaks where you can really get in and engage in conversation. So
exactly. Yeah. All right. So we're seeing a lot of folks with recently updated strategic plans or currently in the process, which sounds about right to me. It feels like almost all of our clients are in that update process. If you're not sure when your strategic plan was last updated, poke around a little bit and see, because it's a really good time to do that and take some of these lessons learned from the last couple of years. So before we sign off, I'm going to go really quickly through just a couple of lessons that we've learned to have effective meetings, maybe things that we haven't all thought about. Julie mentioned, getting that strategic mindset and making sure in every meeting we're connected to our organization. We like to call that mission moment. So how can we connect agenda items? How can we have folks on our team come in and give an operational update, talk about our impact, talk about the ways that the board's decision are actually moving things forward, and really connect us to the work that's happening on the ground. This is effective in any type of organization. I would say we see it most kind of in the not-for-profit space. In the for-profit space, it can be really, really powerful for your board members. I also cannot stress enough starting and ending your meeting on time and holding yourself accountable to that. And even better, if you end your meeting 10 minutes early, everyone will feel really, really good about that. Thinking about how we're following up on things, how we're being accountable to ourselves, how we evaluate our own board meetings. Sometimes at the end of the meeting, a good board will say, how do we do? Anybody have any feedback about how today went? And that can be a really great way to also just kind of work on that very positive culture. We also often see meeting agreements. So starting out the meeting, just having that kind of norms and saying, okay, we're in person, let's try to limit our multitasking. We're going to take longer breaks so you can check in if you need to. I really like the idea of pointing out, folks, can we participate considerately? So if you are a loud voice, if you love to talk, try to take a step back. If you're a quiet voice, this is a safe place for you to speak up. And we want to hear from you, and you're here for a reason. And just think about that and kind of pushing people outside of their comfort zone. Developing a parking lot for issues is a really valuable way, because boards can get sidetracked really easily. And then I think what's important is also to think about, how do we respect and support the decision of the majority? Even if we strive for consensus, can we all walk away from a decision, shake hands, support it, and move on, and not kind of carry the grudges of decisions we might have been in the minority of? If you have a hybrid meeting, a couple of thoughts. Really, really important. Test that technology in advance. Make sure it works for everybody. Make sure it works in the room that you are in. Your meeting owl that has worked 50 times before might not work today. There's nothing more frustrating than being 45 minutes late starting because of things like that. When you're in a hybrid space, also for those folks who are in the room, limiting side talk is really important. It's something that makes folks virtually feel excluded, but it also can be picked up by the microphones and make it hard to hear. Using breakout rooms for folks who are online, making sure that we call on the online folks is really important. And that's why a lot of larger organizations are moving toward using facilitators for hybrid meetings, because of that purpose. And are there ways that can we use technology for everyone? So things like using polling, using Google Jamboards, ways to get folks to all use technology in the room. So Amy, I'm going to hand it back to you. We don't have any time for questions, but we will follow up with anyone who has submitted them. Our contact info is on this slide. And I just want to thank everyone so much for participating today.
All right. Thank you, Colleen and Julie, for a great presentation today. And as Colleen mentioned, their contact information is on the slide deck and in your console as well. You can also drop a note in the Q&A window if you would like to continue this conversation, and we will reach out to you. We also invite you to visit our website for more information on this topic, many of which are linked in your handouts window of your console. And then again, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks as well. And then finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. Your feedback is always appreciated, and thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.